Welcome to Constitution Study Television. I'm your host, Douglas V. Gibbs. These videos are designed to talk about specific constitutional issues. You can look me up at politicalpistachio.com, douglasvgibbs.com, and today I want to talk about war powers. Recently, Congress enacted a war powers resolution against President Trump's actions in Iran and Iraq, where he used airstrikes to take out a high-ranking Iranian official, Soleimani. He's like second in command in Iran. So let's talk about war powers itself. And I remember during the Iraq War, while Bush was president, there was an awful lot of people arguing that it was an illegal war, that President Bush did not have the authority to wage that war without a declaration of war. And a belief through the entire media, especially when it came to the Democrats, was you cannot engage in war of any kind, the president cannot, unless there is a declaration of war. And that's not necessarily true. Let's talk about, first of all, what's specifically in the U.S. Constitution. In the Constitution, the war powers are mentioned essentially twice, really more often, but in detail a couple of times. It says in Article 1, Section 8, that only Congress can declare war. And then it indicates in Article 2 that the president is the commander-in-chief. When you look up the definitions of a commander-in-chief, it means the chief commander, the person in charge of military action, troop movement, and so on and so forth. Now, if you go back to the Articles of Confederation, that was the Constitution before the Constitution, the document separates those two war powers. One it calls to wage war, and the other one to declare war. And in that case, it gave Congress both of those powers. But it did delineate between the two powers. There are two powers involved here. As commander-in-chief, the president has the authority to act in a manner in which military is moved, be it to defend the United States or across the seas. And one of the reasons they gave the presidents that power, and I know this first reason doesn't really apply anymore, was that when it comes to war, time is of the essence. And back then, we didn't have the technology we have today. We didn't have the vehicles that we have today. So, I mean, it may take a couple weeks to let a congressman who is out of session of Congress know that he needs to get to Congress, and then another couple weeks for him to get there by horseback. So if the president has to wait to talk to Congress about committing troops in any particular situation, and it takes a month before Congress is even able to all get together in one room, well, heck, the war could be over by then. So that was one of the reasons that the founders separated the two and gave the president the power as commander-in-chief to act militarily without getting congressional approval necessarily. That said, our system is all about checks and balances. So while the president does have power to wage war as necessary, if Congress believes that the president is waging a war that they would not approve of, or later on, or if he's abusing that power, then they have the power of impeachment. They have the power of defunding the war. No money, no war. Now, when we talk about precedent, and I know those forces that are against the U.S. Constitution tend to fall into a case law and precedent type of mentality. Well, let's talk about precedent then. Has there been precedent of presidents waging war without a declaration of war? Is it constitutional? Well, the first two wars we fought, aside from the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, were the two Barbary Wars. One under President Jefferson, one under President Madison. The Madison War was very short. In both cases, those wars were waged without a declaration of war. So, let's answer the question. Can the president wage war without a declaration of war? Jefferson did it. Madison did it. So now we must ask our question. Did Jefferson and Madison not understand the Constitution, or did they, and they were acting constitutionally? So we have two early wars, Jefferson and Madison, that were waged without a declaration. Now that said, in the long run, the funding for the wars were provided by Congress. Congress decided to approve and so on. And there were some that didn't. And they had the same type of back and forth stuff going on back then as they do now. but the presidents acted upon their war powers as necessary in that case. Then we can go to President Lincoln. President Lincoln really set large precedent regarding war powers. And personally, I'm not a fan of precedent. Either of them is constitutional or it's not. And so when it comes to war powers, I'm not so much worried about precedent as I am what's constitutional. But let's talk about precedent still. During the Civil War, Lincoln appropriated powers that no previous president had wielded. He did things that were unconstitutional. He abused the powers. He used war powers to proclaim a blockade. Now that one I think was fine. But then he suspended the writ of habeas corpus. In other words, he detained people without due process. Americans and other troops. Now, other troops don't require habeas corpus, but Americans do, and he did it to Americans. When I say Americans, I mean members of the North, the Union, because the Confederate States of America were no longer part of the United States at that point, so therefore they were foreign combatants. He spent money before Congress appropriated it for that purpose. Now, that's a tricky one because if money's already set aside for military use, they've already said, okay, this is for the military, and it's just not used exactly in the fashion that they expected militarily. It depends on how the money was marked to be used. All right, and then he imprisoned between 15,000 and or more suspected Confederate sympathizers without trial. Once again, foreign combatants. I'm not going to say that's necessarily unconstitutional, but the suspending habeas corpus, and he pushed the limits of the use of the military in ways, the invasion force stuff without appropriate monies and all that. But what it did is it did expand war powers a little bit, and presidents that followed took that as precedent that they were allowed to do it. Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Johnson, all proclaimed that because of Lincoln, they had certain war powers that they may or may not have had. Now let's talk about 1973, the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act was passed in order to limit the powers of the president. 1973, President Nixon was president. This was in response to Vietnam. So really it was the same kind of thing that Congress did just now with the War Powers Resolution, except for they had both houses that could get it passed. And so Nixon vetoed it, and they overrode the veto, and War Powers Act of 1973 went into place anyway. And a lot of people, when they talk about the war powers of the president, they quote the War Powers Act as if it is legitimate law. And I'll explain that part of it in a moment. Here's what the War Powers Act says. All commitments of troops in hostile situations must be reported within 48 hours. Only a 60-day commitment of troops can be made unless there is a declaration of war or a specific statutory authorization. Troops cannot be committed more than 60 days. Okay, President can send troops into action when authorized by Congress or in case of national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. All right, so let's talk about those for a second real quick. When President Trump committed the airstrike in Iraq against the Iranian leader Soleimani, was there a more than 60-day commitment of troops as a result? Not necessarily. Was there? Did he let Congress know within 48 hours? Yes, he did. He reported it within 48 hours after the action. And finally, did he send troops into action, or in this case, a military equipment into action in the case of a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its authorities, or its possessions, or its armed sources? There was according to him, an imminent threat against U.S. embassies, which are American soil. So I would say on that, he was authorized. Now, that said, let's talk about the War Powers Act in its own right now. What it did is it was designed to limit the constitutional powers of the president. Now, can you change the Constitution without an amendment? No. They're saying they did with the War Powers Act. They further limited the president's powers. They cannot change the president's powers with a piece of legislation. If you want to limit the president's powers, it has to be done through an amendment process. In other words, you have to ask the states, first of all. Second of all, there's something else that's key here. You couldn't limit the president's powers anyway, because what it says in the Constitution is, Article 1, Section 1, that the legislative power shall be vested in a Congress. In Article 2, it says that the executive power shall be vested in a president. And in Article 3, it says that the judicial power shall be vested in the courts. vested is the key word. The word vested means to legally transfer or to grant, but vested also has an additional meaning. If you are to vest something, that means it's irrevocable. In other words, the president cannot have executive powers taken away, and he cannot give executive powers away. They are irrevocable because they were vested in him. So the original intent was that the commander-in-chief can wage war regardless of congressional approval. If they don't like it, they can starve it of money. That's the original intent of that power that was granted to the president. And it was vested in the president. It is irrevocable. It cannot be changed. So the War Powers Act of 1973 is unconstitutional for two reasons. Number one, because legislation can't change the Constitution. Only a amendment can. And second, the powers are vested in the president, so they can't take them away anyway. They're irrevocable powers. In a nutshell, after all of this is talked about, what does that all mean? What it means is that President Bush, when he went into Iraq, President Obama, when he went to Libya, and President Trump, when he sent this airstrike into Iraq to take out Soleimani and other personnel, Iraqi and Iranian high-ranking personnel, and any other military action he sees necessary, are completely constitutional. This does not mean that the president has the authority to run ramshod over Congress on all military matters. Congress does have the power to fund or defund. He should be communicating with his Congress. He should be letting them know. But his first communications is not supposed to be with Congress. It's supposed to be with his national security team, with his advisors, with his consultants, with his cabinet, the executive branch, because it's an executive power. Now, if the war or action, military action, needs a further declaration or expansion, and a declaration of war feels it's necessary, then he can go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war, and Congress can decide whether or not to declare war. A declaration of war, though, does not mean, oh, well, you're allowed to commit war. That's not what it means. It is a formal declaration to the rest of the world that we are in a state of war, so that all other countries know to stay clear of that area. If we have a declaration of war in place and two powers are fighting, and a third power gets involved and they get hit, tough. There's a declaration of war, you should have known better. If there's no declaration of war and a third power gets involved and gets hit, then it's an act of war against that third power. Declaration of war is a formal declaration of the rest of the world. We're in a state of war. Stay out of the way. Don't get involved. None of your business unless you want to be a part of the war. That's essentially what a declaration of war is. It's not a declaration saying, oh, hey, President, you're allowed to wage war. That's not what it means. So in short, in the end, war powers. President has the power to wage war. Congress has the power to declare war. President can wage war as he feels necessary. If the Congress feels he is over-engaging, he is abusing that power, then they could take either monetary action or impeachment action. But the War Powers Act, a piece of legislation, cannot limit his powers. That is something that cannot be done because the executive power has been vested in the president. It's irrevocable, and you cannot change his authorities or powers simply with a piece of legislation. It requires an amendment. So that's war powers. Any questions? Send me an email at constitutionspeaker@yahoo.com. I would love to hear your feedback, or you can leave a comment. I do read all the comments whenever there are comments on these videos. And feel free to visit my websites, politicalpistachio.com, douglasvgibbs.com. Don't forget to donate also at either one of those websites. Thank you for watching. United we stand, combined we kick butt. God bless America, my friends. God bless you. Where we go one, we go all. Stay constitutional. We'll see you next time.